Now, operators have often cited the lack of infrastructure as one of the banes of Nigeria's telecom sector. So how can the government scale up revenue from this sector? Lami Adekola, co-founder and director of Hamilton & George, joins us to discuss this. Lami, thank you so much. Pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So, when we talk about the telecom sector, it's always about, investments. I guess from that perspective, investment, how much the operators are willing to invest, and how the operating environment is also treating them in return. What can you tell us about that?
Okay, the telecommunication space is highly capital intensive, as we all know. And in the past, quite a number of telecom companies in Nigeria have put in significant funds into it. And in the same vein, I must say they've also received significant returns as well, probably even more than what they've projected. Okay. But significant investments are still required in infrastructure, because we still have the prevalence of poor services, especially in the rural areas. So
what needs to happen to unlock this much needed investment?
It's a combination of regulation and inducement.
I think we need more regulation.
Let me take it from the point of view of this. For example, in the last 9 months, I've been privileged to travel to the hinterlands of Nigeria, and I've realized that the service quality we get here in Lagos and Abuja and the rest is different from what you are getting in way deep down in Ogbomoso, for example. You have high drop calls, you have significant rates of very poor internet, and all of this would be owing to the fact that the people that live in some of these areas might not be able to pay for the service. So these telecom companies do not see significant economic push to make an investment in those areas. But that said, you are making so much from the economy itself. Rural telephony is a must, because it helps with development. It helps with improving the lives of the people in these areas in terms of access to information and all whatnot. So that's where the regulation part comes in. In areas where it might not make ultimate investment sense for these telecommunications companies to put in better infrastructure, then regulation should try to compel them. Either that, or we start looking for improved rural telephony schemes where we would look for new investors, separate from this current telecommunications companies, to say, look, we're licensing you specifically for these rural areas. But for them, it would be cannibalizing their space.
But would it be, I'm trying to imagine that, would it now come with what, a different set of incentives, or?
Yeah, most likely. A different set of incentives in the sense of cheaper regulatory payments and dues and all whatnot, tax incentives, and a couple of things that would encourage investments in the sector generally. But I've just taken one leg of it, which is rural telephony. But let's come home to the general telephony we experience. Even here in the urban areas, we still have a significantly high prevalence of poor telecommunication services. But that said, it's not all terrible for the sector, because last year we hit our target of 30% broadband penetration in Nigeria. And that's a good thing, because there's a lot of literature on the correlation between increased broadband penetration and economic growth. So for that, I would say good stuff for the sector, and we would reap the dividends of that this year. Another significant thing that occurred last year was the licenses of some infracos, infrastructure companies. And we would also start seeing renewed investments from these infracos that would benefit and improve the general quality of internet and voice. So investment is needed, but I also think improved regulation as well. The Act, I think it's 2003, hasn't really been talked about and renewed. But the truth is, the act was premised largely on voice.
Yes.
But the world is moving. It's no longer
absolutely.
voice.
I was just going to talk, technology, but then looking at the sector as a whole here in Nigeria, it's one sector we've celebrated a lot, the privatization, how it just exploded and we had all these players coming in. But if you looking at Nigeria, putting it alongside other African pairs like Kenya, for instance, would you say that with the number of years we've had to develop this sector, to grow it, on all fronts, you talked about rural telephony now, that's not so great. Would you say that it's something we have made significant progress? And looking at the next 10 years, 15 years, for instance, at this pace, what can we achieve?
Well, as you rightly said, the telecommunication space is one that Nigeria is proud of because it's a success story for privatization and how that can totally liberalize a sector. That said, internet penetration is at around 50%, which is not bad compared to our other peers. But that said, what's the quality of this internet? It's one thing to have good penetration, about 98 million Nigerians having access to the internet, usually mostly via their mobile phones. But what's the quality of this? So we need to start talking about quality. And our service providers have to understand that if we are not getting the right quality, then they shouldn't be able to bill us for quality that is not being provided.
Speaking about that, on the revenue side of things for the companies, would you say that, on the revenue side of things, I know that, there's been this, transitioning from voice to data as a way in terms of revenue, but would you say that, they haven't done too badly from a revenue? I know they complain a lot, FX issues, taxes on infrastructure, equipment, etc. But revenue for these guys.
For most of them, revenue-wise, it's not been terrible. I'll use MTN, even with all the regulatory issues they've had in Nigeria and all whatnot. They still reported, I think, a 20% growth, and most of their returns come from the Nigerian market. And, there are areas of the sector that are not being considered seriously yet. So mobile money is not yet as big a thing as it should be in Nigeria, and that is massive. That's a whole new green field, if you permit me to say, where they can explore. That is also partly regulation that is affecting it, because there's a little bit of confusion as to who should rule, who should take charge of mobile money. Should it be the banks or should it be the telcos? But if we have the right regulation in place, we would decide who would take ownership of it, or a partnership or whatever, and that starts moving. So this market holds immense potential for this telco companies and investors. And with a peaceful election that has just occurred and relatively peaceful, we expect things to grow.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to us today. Lami Adekola, co-founder and director of Hamilton & George.